Hello and welcome back to Science of Medicine. Today I want to begin talking about the gastrointestinal system and starting off talking about sort of the structure and pieces that make this up. And then in the next section we'll talk more about the details of how those sections work together. Now it's pretty remarkable that I can take something and put it in my mouth and have all the nutrients that I need for my body to live extracted from it and to put the waste out of the other end. But that's precisely what the gastrointestinal system does. It is basically a tubular structure from my mouth to my anus by which that occurs. I have several components of this system. The oral cavity where I'll macerate the food, the esophagus which will connect me to the stomach, then I'll go through the small and large intestine and finally out the anus. I have some accessory organs, in particular the liver and the exocrine portion of the pancreas that also are critical in this functioning. And in the second portion of this, I will talk about that and the details associated with them. Now, most of my gastrointestinal tract is located in my abdomen, and it's in a peritoneal cavity that is lined through which this tubular structure will go. And sometimes people will have a small rupture or a large rupture in the hollow tube, and the bacteria that live within your gastrointestinal tract might escape and cause an infection within this peritoneal cavity. We call this peritonitis, and this can be life-ending if not treated appropriately. So this peritoneal cavity becomes an important component of where this gastrointestinal tract is seated. But if you were to actually open up and view the inside of the peritoneal cavity, when you would open it up, the first thing that you would actually see is the omentum, this apron that actually comes down over the GI tract, particularly the intestines, and that is really an organ system unto itself. It does many things which we're just now beginning to understand. One of the things that it will do is to, if there is an area of inflammation in, let's say, the bowel, it will sort of encapsulate this to protect it from becoming stuck to another portion of the bowel or another portion. Because anytime things are sticky inside the body, they will tend to stick together and can fistulize or cause an abnormal connection between the two. So the omentum is very important in this. I expect that across the next several years that we will learn more about the functioning of the omentum. Now, if you look at both the majority of the bowel, which is the small intestine, you will see that it is connected through a mesentery. And this mesentery has lots of blood vessels that go in it, and it's really quite beautiful. It keeps the small intestine, in a sense, very much organized. And in fact, when people, surgeons do bowel surgery, they will sort of run the bowel and actually go over this mesentery and follow it to be able to get it in order. This mesentery actually contains a number of blood vessels that will perfuse or provide oxygenated blood to the bowel. And these blood vessels come off ultimately of the aorta, which, if you remember, will come out of the left ventricle. It goes through the thorax and then descends into the abdomen. Now, the first one off is the celiac artery, and then down below that, the superior and then the inferior mesenteric arteries. So there are three major arteries that are supplying my gastrointestinal tract with oxygenated blood. But I also have the portal vein. That is going to be the blood vessel that takes the nutrient-rich blood that has been absorbed from the gastrointestinal tract and pass it to the liver. Now, each of these arteries, the celiac, the SMA, and the IMA, will supply different regions based upon their location as to where that, which organs or which portions of the gastrointestinal tract are actually supplies. The celiac artery will provide branches that will go to the stomach, the liver, the duodenum, and the pancreas, whereas the superior mesenteric artery will do the pancreas, duodenum, jejunum, ileum, and the top portion or transverse colon. The inferior mesenteric artery will also provide oxygenated blood to the colon. It's very interesting about each of these arteries because embryologically, when arteries grow, they also grow with a nerve and a vein. And these will come out embryologically from certain types of embryologic structures. So, for example, in the gut, there is a foregut, midgut, and hindgut. And so what that means is that the celiac artery, which will supply sort of foregut structures, the SMA, midgut, and the inferior mesenteric artery, the hindgut, will provide also not only blood supply, but there's also a nerve that grows with this. And even though the individual innervations don't necessarily follow exactly this distribution for the arteries, they're very useful clinically. And the reason for that is through a concept of what's called referred pain. So in referred pain, inside your body, it's not like I'm touching your finger or some other localized surface sensor that can tell where I'm touching. Inside the body, it's poorly innervated in terms of the organs. And so what will happen is that you will have pain from any of the structures that are in, let's say, a foregut structure that will be referred to where the celiac artery will actually innervate or go to, which is in this just below the rib cage. And around the umbilicus is going to be the superior mesenteric arteries nerve structure that will come in that will be referred, and then down a little bit lower will be the inferior mesenteric artery. So if you know whether the structure is a foregut, a midgut, or a hindgut structure embryologically, you can tell from the referred pain pattern where that might be. And this is useful clinically and used by surgeons as well as clinicians. Now, the overall function of my gastrointestinal tract is to take what I put into my mouth, which is going to be something that is comprised of some components of maybe a carbohydrate, a protein, lipid, and then everything else that's undigestible. You can call it fiber or roughage or whatever you would want to say. Take that in, take the nutrients, break them down so that they can be absorbed, take the micronutrients and allow them to be transported in, and to then take that into the body. Now, in order to do this, you have to secrete things that will break them down, such as digestive enzymes. Those will work at various pHs, so you need to control that. You need to be able to move the components from one place to another, and then you need to absorb those small molecules or ions and fluids. You have to coordinate this so that it's done in a very specific way. And this coordination is so complicated that it's done via both control systems, the nervous system as well as the hormonal system. And the nervous system you normally think about is maybe the central nervous system, your brain and your spinal cord, as well as your peripheral nerves. But in fact, the nervous system that you have within your gut is highly complex. In addition, you have glands that will secrete hormones, small molecules that will travel through the blood to cause some effect. And we'll talk about those in a little bit. Now, as I mentioned to you, one of the critical things about the gut is that you have to be able to move things from one location to another in a particular way. And so really, when you talk about the oral cavity and the upper 1/3 basically of the esophagus, those are comprised of skeletal muscles. I can move my tongue, I can move my mouth, I can actually deal with conscious movements in the back of my throat as well as in the upper portions of my esophagus that are in the back of the throat to allow me to control this. But once I get down to the lower 2/3 of the esophagus all the way to the end of the gastrointestinal tract, that is under smooth muscle control. And smooth muscle has a very specific kind of way in which it operates that we'll talk about in a minute. But I wanted to talk to you about this tubular structure as I'm going down from the esophagus through most of my gut. So the lumen of this is actually in intimate contact with the mucosa. And the mucosa, in this case, this is a cross-sectional view of a portion in the duodenum. But the mucosa can have different types of cells, which we will talk about in the second lecture that we actually talk about the different components. Underneath that is a submucosa, an area of connective tissue, blood vessels, and the enteric nervous system. And then surrounding that are two layers of muscle. This is the muscularis layer. And that allows for this, what we call peristaltic movement, ideally the single directional movement of substances from one location to another. Outside of that, then I have additional connective tissue. We call that the serosa. And if I look at this movement of the muscle, peristalsis, this is very, very coordinated. This is a plot that is looking at movement of a bolus of food through the esophagus. If I look along the y-axis, that's sort of going down the esophagus, and then across the x-axis is time. And the amplitude of this three-dimensional plot is looking at the amplitude of the pressure wave, this peristaltic wave. And what you see is that there is a coordinated way of moving food and moving this pressure wave down as we move that bolus of food. What that does is it requires coordinated contraction and relaxation of the smooth muscle. If you have a food bolus in one location, you have to be able to contract proximal to it and relax distal to it so that it can actually be moved down. This is a very complicated procedure, but fortunately for us, it's handled autonomically. It's handled through the autonomic nervous system as well as the enteric nervous system and the hormonal control. Now, as I mentioned before, for most of your gastrointestinal tract, it will involve movement through smooth muscle. Now, smooth muscle is comprised of these sheets of smaller muscle fibers than compared to skeletal muscles. And it's found mostly in the gastrointestinal tract, although it is found also in the muscle that controls pupil dilation and contraction, as well as surrounding blood vessels. Now, like skeletal muscle, the basic idea of myosin binding to actin, pivoting, and then walking along actin filaments is the same. Same in cardiac, same in skeletal muscle, as well as in smooth muscle. But outside of that, the process by which this occurs is radically different in smooth muscle compared to skeletal muscle. There is no neuromuscular junction. Instead, as I mentioned, there are an enteric nervous system, an autonomic nervous system, as well as hormones that will control this and that we'll talk about later on. Now, the smooth muscle, unlike skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle, does not have troponin. It has calmodulin. And calmodulin does bind with calcium, much like troponin does, but when it binds with calcium, it activates myosin kinase. You may remember that kinases are enzymes that will add a phosphate to, in some cases, activate, but in this case, activate myosin. And once that myosin is phosphorylated, it will then be able to bind to actin. So I no longer have that troponin complex, which has to move out of the way to allow for myosin to bind. I have to actually make the myosin phosphorylated so that it will then bind and pivot when it binds to actin. Same process for which actin and myosin are moving past one another. And as the calcium concentration drops lower, it activates myosin phosphatase, which dephosphorylates or deactivates myosin in this case. Now, as I've mentioned a few times, these coordinated movements of peristalsis are under both neurologic as well as hormonal control. I have a general control in the autonomic nervous system. We've talked in the past about the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system. Parasympathetic nervous system is sort of a rest in relaxation, sympathetic as more of a fight or flight system. And so in that regard, The autonomic nervous system can increase, for the parasympathetic nervous system, the activity of the GI tract, or the sympathetic nervous system can inhibit the activity of the GI tract. But beyond that, it doesn't have specific roles. Instead, there is an enteric nervous system. The myenteric or Auerbach's plexus controls the movement. It controls peristalsis. And the submucosal or Meissner's plexus controls the secretions of blood flow to allow for absorption of nutrients that's coordinated with where that bolus of nutrients, rich food or substance is actually moving through the gastrointestinal tract. We also have multiple hormonal controls through different agents, and I'll talk about those now. So there are many hormones that are at play in the gastrointestinal system. I've selected 5 big players, but there are other players in here. These are typically the ones that are discussed in an introductory level medical physiology type class, but there are others. So the first one is gastrin. Now gastrin is secreted by G cells in the stomach, also in the duodenum and the jejunum, and it stimulates hydrochloric acid secretion from the parietal cells. It also stimulates mucosal growth, and so sometimes you will have a very rare condition called a gastrinoma, which is a gastrin secreting tumor, and you will have hypertrophy or overgrowth of that mucosa that will stimulate more hydrochloric acid secretion. Cholecystokinin is another hormone that is active in the gastrointestinal tract, and CCK is secreted by eye cells in the small intestine, duodenum, jejunum, and ileum. And it will stimulate bicarbonate, which is used to neutralize that hydrochloric acid gets secreted, that gets squirted out of the pyloric sphincter from the stomach. And also pancreatic enzymes from the exocrine pancreas, which we'll talk about in the next lecture. It also is involved in gallbladder contraction. Gallbladder is going to be a storage component for bile, which is basically a detergent that helps with the breaking down of lipids, and it inhibits gastric emptying. So CCK or cholecystokinin has several functions. Motilin, secreted by M cells in the duodenum and the jejunum, stimulates gastric and intestinal motility. It's nice because the name implies what it actually does, and even the cells that it's secreted from. Secretin, similarly named in that, secreted by S cells in this case, of the duodenum and the jejunum and ileum, stimulates certain types of things from the exocrine pancreas. It also stimulates the bicarbonate. It inhibits gastric acid secretion and also stimulates pepsin. Gastric inhibitory peptide is something that's been of great interest because it actually stimulates insulin release. Now, insulin is a hormone that is released from the endocrine portion of the pancreas, which is a very small portion of the pancreas that we'll talk about more when we talk about the endocrinology control system. But it has been studied as a potential therapeutic target for diabetics. And it inhibits gastric acid secretion also. It comes from the duodenum and the jejunum K cells. So I hope this has given you an overview of some of the anatomy of the gastrointestinal system and some of the main players. We're going to look in the next section about the specific portions of the gastrointestinal tract and how they actually perform their function. As always, if you're interested in this, you're welcome to subscribe to this channel, or you can leave me any kinds of comments that are reasonable. And I'm looking forward to seeing you the next time in Science and Medicine.